Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor Uri McMillan, who's a professor of English, African American Studies, and Gender Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Uri is the author of the book Embodied Avatars, Genealogies of Black Feminist Art and Performance. He is, in fact, my label mate, published by New York University. How are you doing today?
Good, how are you?
First of all, congratulations on all the awards that you received for the book. You know, folks hear performance studies, and immediately they're thinking about folks who do dance.
Right.
They're thinking about theater. Performance studies, particularly in relationship to Black studies, really is something that's a wider and vibrant form. Talk a little bit about your relationship to performance studies, particularly in the context of Black studies.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think there's a way that folks in those fields, which actually, you're right, has become like a really big conversation. I think, yeah, we've been really interested in thinking about performance in much broader terms, you know? So I think there are some of us who do things like dance, but I think a lot of us, particularly Black popular culture, for instance, right, I think is one thing. I think many of us are really interested in visual art, but not doing art history in art historical ways, but like the way, like what does performance studies do when we look at aesthetics that's different? So I've been thinking that, and I think, I mean, literature, I mean, I think what we do in performance studies is like, I think people who are at the intersection of both fields are really trying to kind of think about putting them together in really interesting ways. So I think there's many ways in which performance studies, the objects of analysis have not always, there's been people who've been left out of the conversation. You know, so I think that's something we've been thinking about.
You're visiting Duke, you're one of the keynote speakers for the Global Blackness conversation that's being curated by the Department of African American Studies here. You did your talk on Grace Jones, and in some ways, you know, in retrospect, we think about Grace Jones in 2017, and why haven't we always been thinking about Grace Jones as a text? But in some ways, she's become kind of a central point of these conversations now in ways that she hadn't been before. You know, when I think about your work, I think about some of the work that Joan Morgan is doing, you know, particularly around this idea of Grace Jones and her Caribbeanness. Talk a little bit about Grace Jones as a text, and particularly her influence, you know, whether or not it's stated or not for generations of folks who come afterwards. I'm thinking specifically about Nicki Minaj in that context.
I think there's a whole genealogy of contemporary pop people that you can trace back to her. So I think like Lady Gaga is a really obvious example. Rihanna, I think is somebody else. I mean, Nicki definitely too. I mean, I just think there's this interesting way that there's this genealogy of like women in pop music who we now take for granted are using a lot of the tropes that kind of like theatricality that Grace really started, you know. And I've even been thinking about something like One Man Show, you know, like I read a review of Hilton Allison in the New Yorker where he made this case. So like, you know, even something like Beyonce's Lemonade, the prototype for something like that was One Man Show. You know, so I think there's this interesting way that that's taken a while for people to catch up, which I think is partly what the appeal of Grace Jones is, right? She's kind of like always one step ahead of everybody else. So even despite being like a 4-decade career, like we are just now sort of catching up to where she is. And I think there's also something generationally that's interesting that's happening. So I think, for instance, with her headlining Afropunk last year, you know, and also like, you know, like the appeal for like a different generation of fans for her. Like, so like, you know, what Grace Jones means to like someone like my age now, like, or even people who are younger than me. So I think that's part of one of the things I've been thinking about. And I think for scholars, I think like for Joan Morgan and other people, for instance, there's just so many layers to her work, you know? Like I think when I first started thinking about Grace Jones, I was a little bit initially, a little bit apprehensive. I mean, like the body of work, there's so much, there's so much there, you know, and it's not necessarily easy work to write about.
And in ways, you know, and we could talk broadly about performance studies in this regard, but there's a way in which, you know, Grace Jones herself is an ambivalent project within Black studies, right? If not Black America writ large, right? You know, it was easy to perhaps argue 30 years ago that maybe she's outside of Blackness in ways because of the Caribbeanness, right? We think about Bob Marley's relationship to Black America within that context. It clearly wasn't just that, right? It's the presentation of androgyny, it's the hypersexuality, right? But not in a kind of traditional Black woman's body within that context. Some of those ambivalences have disappeared, but they haven't. Talk a little bit about that.
I've been thinking about it through politics. So I've been thinking about it, for instance, in like this recent resurgence of interest in someone like Nina Simone, right? So what I've been thinking about, what's interesting about the two of them, it's like, oh, that's what it is. Like, if it's not someone who has easily identifiable politics or someone who's like a quote unquote role model, then we don't want to do anything with her. So I think that's partly what it is. And I think there's also something, about whiteness, like I think there's a particular way, like what happens when you are somebody who like your cultural influences are not all Black or even Black American, or even Jamaican, but actually are also like kind of Eurocentric in some ways too. So I think there's a way that I think because the body of work escapes national borders too, I think that's also part of what has made it hard for Black studies to claim her in a particular way.
When we think about Grace Jones now, right, and of course you have her brother, the minister, which in some ways brings her into a fold in the way that we hadn't seen her brought into the fold before. Obviously there's the memoir that does that kind of work. But then take somebody like Nicki Minaj. And you write about Nicki in Embodied Avatars, right, this idea of a grotesque aesthetic, right, and that's as much about her performance in Monster as it is just about her physicality. Oh, absolutely. In that regard. I think there's a way, because of the white gaze that Grace Jones had, that even if folks weren't embracing her, they took her serious as an art entity because of this white gaze. Yeah. Nicki didn't get produced by that same white gaze. And I think sometimes we're apt to toss her away as an artist. Oh, yeah. When she clearly is doing something much more complicated than just being a female rapper with a big butt. Talk a little bit about, thinking about Nicki Minaj as performance art. I think part of the issue is what counts as quote unquote like high art. I think maybe that's where the tension is, right? So I think maybe it's because Grace Jones, what she's doing is it's like more recognizable as being artistic in a way that what Nicki. And so I think there's this tension, and I think you write about this tension between kind of like high art versus like popular culture, it's like low art. So I think that's really part of the tension. And I think it's also like, Nicki is not aspiring towards those ideals either. Like I think she's very comfortable in her lane, Like, so I think there's a way that I think that's part of what the issue is. But yeah, I think there's a way that like, and I think, I've read like about camp, right? Like, if we think about what she's doing in terms of camp and theatricality and artifice, then I think what she's doing becomes more present as like a practice and like a strategy, So I think there's that. And I think there's also the confusion about, Onika Maraj versus Nicki Minaj. And I think that kind of conflation that people do. And I'm like, no, if you actually think Onika is actually not the same person per se, then like it's actually a persona that she's performing. I think maybe that also helps as well. What about the fact that, and this is something that's writ large in hip hop, the erasure of Caribbeanness. Whether we're talking Busta Rhymes or Jay-Z, I mean, any number of figures who clearly have ties to the Caribbean that gets erased. But there's a layer that if we actually apply a kind of Caribbean lens to Nicki actually makes sense. In that case, when we think about things like Carnival and things like that, absolutely. Do you think that's as much about her trying to erase that to make her more marketable, or is it just our inability to see Caribbeanness as something that's distinct, from a kind of Black Americanness in this moment? I think it's both. Because I think there's a way, I think like Rihanna's a good analog to this, right? This way that Rihanna's Caribbeanness has been erased, although not completely, it's more present. It's not erased from her voice, right? When she speaks, right? You hear it. Right. But yeah, I thought the same thing, and I thought about this when I was trying to think about this with Nicki, like when I went to Carnival and like Barbados, or even like, the West Indian Day Parade in Brooklyn, everything that Nicki does makes complete sense because you see a lot of women who are like, it's a one day out of the year where you get to kind of perform this kind of hypersexuality. But at the same time, you'll see women wearing costumes who are like holding hands with their kids, So there's this way where it's like hypersexuality is not always about sex. Like it's a performance strategy. And I think in the Caribbean, that performance strategy is more present in a way that's not present to us in the US. So I think it's partly that. But I even think like Pon de Alarm,
to Stop the Alarm, or it's like the video that Nicki Minaj did where it actually was set in Trinidad, you know, which people don't really talk about, but I thought, you know, that video made it very clear.
Who she was.
Yeah, like she wasn't trying to erase her Caribbeanness at all.
Yeah.
But I think partly it is something about hip hop in the US, you know, so I think that's interesting, especially with someone like Drake now, right? It's like you have like Nicki from Trinidad by way of Queens, you know, like Drake from Toronto. So kind of it's interesting, like kind of like the biggest stars and kind of like black pop stars and hip hop and R&B are actually not from the US.
Yeah.
Like I find that to be like really interesting.
You made a point earlier, you know, we always in black studies and particularly black cultural production get caught up in these notions of authenticity. And Drake, for a range of reasons, right, is kind of a focal point at this moment for us talking about authenticity.
Oh, yeah.
You know, whether it's about his Canadian identity, whether about it's his mixed race identity, whether or not it's about he writes his own songs with all these kind of tracking songs, right, circulating on the web. Do you think that conversation about authenticity really gets us anywhere at this point in time?
I don't think it does. I think there's been a way, I've been really interested in a way that that's actually been hyper fetishized, particularly in hip hop in ways I feel like are not productive.
Not productive.
And partly because what you talked about, because I mean, even if like, you know, when you go all the way back, I mean, a lot of the sample, like disco samples that were used on hip hop records. So this whole idea of like disco and rap being complete opposites is also not completely true.
Right.
Or even like, you know, Puerto Rican rappers who were like part of the early history.
The early days, right.
You know, so I think there's this way that like we have made it into like, it's supposed to be this black American thing, but hip hop has never been that. It's always been like.
Or Bambaataa queerness, right? And folks don't want to name it as that, right? It's all these other things, including the criminal piece. No one just wants to say Bambaataa queerness, right?
Right. Yeah, so there is this really particular way, it's like, you know, like we don't have to simplify the story of hip hop to make it accessible to people. And for some reason,
especially
I think,
not now. Right?
Yeah, and I think there's this way we feel like we've had to do that work. And it's like, no, like it's always been kind of like a polyvocal, multilingual, multi-country conversation. You know, I think it's only become more present now because like the music has circulated in that way. Yeah. You know, so I think it's just interesting to kind of think of it in that way, like to think about even like, you know, women who were in hip hop who also were not technically Black American either, you know?
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Uri McMillan, who is Associate Professor of English, African American Studies, and Gender Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. He is the author of the book, Embodied Avatars, Genealogies of Black Feminist Art and Performance, published by New York University Press. So for a moment, we're going to imagine that Black Studies departments had drafts. Every year, like NBA teams.
Oh,
right?
wow.
And so in that context, I'm actually going to talk about it in the context of an expansion draft, right?
Okay.
Where you're drafting a new team. So let's, for the sake of argument, say that I was drafting a Black Studies department, right? And I got 5 picks. And I'm going to toss out as my first 5 picks, Uri McMillan, Jessica Marie Johnson, Erica Edwards. I'm going to put Simone Brown in that context. And for the visual piece, I'm going to throw John Jennings in that. If you were to take that Black Studies 5 and think about what Black Studies was even 15 years ago, let alone 30 years ago, that, you know, the Black Studies that I just named would look foreign.
Yeah, I would.
To many of the folks who built it as a discipline, you know, going back 30 or 40 years ago. Where do you see Black Studies at this point in time?
I think Black Studies is having a reckoning in many ways. I think that we have gotten a lot of departments established. I mean, some of them, I mean, UCLA just only happened like a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago. I think people are really starting to question, like, you know, what is Black Studies supposed to do? Or actually, what should it do? You know, and I think what's happening now is a much more expansive conversation around that, you know? So I think part of it's even like the level of methodology is also like the level of like what objects count as Black Studies objects, you know? So I think there's this way that for that, you know, if we're going with those 5 people, you know, even like someone like, you know, John Jennings with like and working at the intersection of like, you know, Afrofuturism, comic book aesthetics, you know, what Jessica Marie Johnson is doing with like Black Code studies. You know, I just think there's a really interesting dialogue that would be happening, which I think is partly also about breaking down boundaries between the disciplines and kind of reimagining what the disciplines are supposed to do, which I think, you know, is also what the work of Black Studies is supposed to do too, which is like, it's not necessarily about institutionalizing Black Studies, it's about actually what does the gaze of Black Studies do that transforms what the disciplines actually look like?
And it's an interesting question, right? Because, you know, you're partially appointed in an English department at UCLA, and they're not having those conversations in English departments.
No, not at all.
They're not having those conversations in sociology departments, right? It's something about, you know, we might think about it as an ethnic studies formation, we might think about a gender and sexuality studies formation, but, you know, what is it about Black Studies that the question can't simply be about the work, but what the work does, right? Who the work is affecting, where the work travels, and all those kinds of questions.
I think one of the things I learned, although I didn't realize I learned this, was I think that partly what a Black Studies degree enables you to do, or maybe what I think it's like, I kind of assume it's like, you don't have to have an allegiance to any discipline, really. Not even really Black Studies, to be honest. I mean, I think like, the thing I kind of learned was actually, it's almost like a post-disciplinary project. I think we use interdisciplinary almost to the point where like it hasn't meant anything anymore. And I think now, like, I like the idea of post-disciplinary because I think the way that I travel, I'm not really having any adherence to any one particular methodology about thinking about things. I'm actually more interested in like what the objects allow you to travel to do.
And then you find the theory to allow you to talk about the objects,
but I also think, you know, part of what even that cohort you mentioned is like, you know, like a bottom-up theory where like the theory is not about like, let's apply people from the canon to talk about these people, you know, like it's always like the same 5 people. It's actually like, no, like artists create theory, like musical artists create theory, visual artists create theory. You know, so that's what I've been more interested in thinking about.
It's actually rare that I get people sitting across from me who actually do popular culture. That actually would be kind of surprising given how long we've been doing the show. What are you watching? What are you listening to these days?
Oh, that's a loaded question. What have I been listening to? See, I go back and forth. So like, I'm kind of like, I like to listen to a lot of old school stuff and then new school stuff. So
I
like,
work to old stuff, right?
Okay. So I listen to a lot of disco. I listen to a lot of Tina Marie lately. What else do I listen to?
Never out of style.
Tina Marie, Sade, occasionally Rick James, not that often. I feel like I'm outing myself by saying that. What else have I been listening to? Nicki, always. Beyonce, more and more. I try to get into Frank Ocean's latest work. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it. You know, and even like I've been watching Insecure, so I've been listening to some of the music from that soundtrack.
Yeah. You know, Frank Ocean is an interesting story because you get the sense of someone who has so much music that he doesn't quite know what to do with it. And in that ways, you might think about, you know, the influence of someone like Prince, who also had so much music, but seemed to have in his mind at least some sort of idea on how, you know, he was going to direct that into the world in a way that it felt more curated than anything.
Well, that's interesting because I think there's like someone like Kanye too. Like there's these artists who actually you can hear it in the music, like almost like you're a visual artist too.
Right.
You know, just to like I think with Frank Ocean's latest album, I mean, you can hear it from like the very first song. You're like, okay, like you're actually visualizing things as you're making music.
Think for a moment, how does, you know, when you think about Lemonade now, right? And I think about Lemonade as a text in itself, obviously, but its impact on how we think about music now, right? And I think about Common's Black America Now, again, project, which, you know, he does his wonderful little visual piece, you know. You got Bradford Young who shoots it, you know, Ava's executive producer. You know, he's not invested in doing that kind of image making without, you know, Lemonade, right? Almost every artist now has to consider. You know, everybody's trying to figure out where Khalil Joseph is and whatnot they can get on his schedule, right, to shoot something for them at this period of time. And it also marks, I think, a moment, you know, you mentioned Krista Thompson's work and this idea of shine. You know, there's a way in which Black culture has always been visual, but we didn't necessarily have access to the technology to do that. And now that the technology is so accessible, we're actually seeing this flourishing, right, of Black visual culture.
Yeah, because I think part of it's also the return to the music video, right? So this way, like the music video was not completely abandoned as a form, but sort of abandoned in a way that like it wasn't seen as like a high art form.
Right.
You know, so I think it's been interesting, and I think part of it's because of MTV. Like, you know, I think like MTV switched to kind of like a reality TV station.
Right.
And like, you know, all the music videos are now, it's YouTube and Vivo.
Right.
But I think, yeah, I think there's a way that like Lemonade has started this thing where like, you know, I think, because I've been even piecing together all the layers of like, you know, it's a Khalil Joseph, then it's like, you know, Melina who directed the video, you know, then it's like the influence of her mother who also collects African-American art.
Right.
You know, and even someone like Solange's work, you see like all the layers too.
Right.
You know, I've just been really thinking about that. And I think, yeah, there's been an interesting way that all of a sudden music videos as art forms has come back finally.
Right.
You know, since I think like the 90s was almost like the last period where we kind of had it.
And as black art, right? Whereas in the 1980s, we talked about all these kind of white directors and that kind of MTV white, you know, rock music aesthetic for these videos, right?
Right.
This is all coming off the platforms of black artists who are thinking about this visual.
And yeah, and so the point you actually see like direct influences from like black contemporary artists. So even like, you know, Lorna Simpson basically doing like Common's album cover.
Right.
You know, there's just been an interesting way. And it's like, oh, this is interesting. Like at first it was like, you know, fashion people talking to music people. And now it's like fashion, music, art people. Everything's kind of collapsing in an interesting way.
I mean, the way that Lemonade recovers Daughters of the Dust, right? You know, in ways that I don't think we would have ever imagined that in that kind of context.
But then also had the power to make Daughters of the Dust get reissued.
Right.
You know, which I thought was really interesting. I was like, huh, like whoever would have thought that like Beyonce would have been responsible for like Julie Dash being rediscovered.
Right. and it complicates our notion of what we think the labor of a Beyonce is, right? And because again, we kind of want to throw, some folks want to put her off on the side as doing kind of frivolous work that doesn't have that self-centered and all these kinds of things, but yet she's created these platforms for these artists that we wouldn't know about, you know, without her actually putting in that work.
Yeah, because I'm even, you know, I'm teaching Lemonade next quarter, and I was thinking about even like Solange's work, and like there's like certain stills, you can pause a video of Solange's music videos, and it's like, that's a black contemporary artist. Like you don't know that, but like if you put them together. Like,
you know,
You know, so I think there's a way it's interesting to teach that to students because they don't always get all the references. And it's like, okay, I know you love Lemonade, but like, you know, there's a lot of historical precursors to that.
What's next for you, Uri?
I have been toying with the idea of writing about Sade recently.
And I imagine I know there's no critical work that's ever been done.
Yeah, there's just nothing there. And I was like, it might be interesting to see what I could do with that.
And it gets to the diaspora piece, right? And she's someone who complicates the diaspora piece in many ways.
But I was also thinking about it because of that image that showed up on Instagram recently of like Drake is like hugging up on her and people are like, oh my God. And I noticed like the comments were like, oh, we love Sade, please come back. And then I noticed there's some other comments from younger people I could tell were like, they had no idea who she was.
Right.
You know, so I've been thinking about her influence, particularly even like with hip hop, you know, like people name drop her in songs, even like, you know, Jay-Z did that collaboration with her, which I think she hated. So yeah, I've been thinking about probably adding her into the project too, and thinking about her as another person who we all kind of love, but also we haven't really looked at in Black studies either.
Who else would you put in that context? I mean, because that sounds like a book project in and of itself to recover these kind of black unknowns, black known unknowns, right? We know who these folks are, but we don't really know much about them.
I've been thinking about someone like Adiva too.
Yeah.
It's another person because I was thinking about Adiva through Grace Jones. So I was like, oh, another person who I listen to a lot, but I was like, I don't think a lot of people think about her in these conversations either. Yeah, so like obscure people, you know, seems to kind of be the trend of what I do.
We've been joined today by Professor Uri McMillan, who's Associate Professor of English, African American Studies, and Gender Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. He's the author of the award-winning Embodied Avatars, Genealogies of Black Feminist Art and Performance, published by New York University. Thanks for joining us, Uri.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.